I always believed marriage meant safety, that the man you vowed your life to would never become the very person who'd strip it away. But sometimes the betrayal doesn't come as a whispered lie. It comes as a pen shoved into your hand, forcing you to sign your life away. My name is Natalia, I'm 30 years old, and for years I thought I had everything most women dreamed of. A beautiful mansion just outside of Seattle with sprawling glass windows that caught the morning light. A husband named Michael, who, at least on the outside, seemed devoted, and a lifestyle that made others envious. I wore tailored dresses, attended charity galas, and smiled at neighbors who whispered about how lucky I was. But behind those polished appearances, a different truth simmered. One I only started to glimpse in fragments before the full storm came crashing down. Michael was charming, too charming, the kind of man who could convince anyone of anything. It's what made him successful in business, and in the beginning, what made me fall for him. When we married, I was 24, still bright-eyed, working as a graphic designer, believing love meant forever. He swept me off my feet with expensive dinners, flowers that arrived at my office just because, and promises of a life where I would never have to worry again. At first, I thought I'd won the jackpot, but money is a strange thing. It doesn't just change people, it magnifies what's already inside them. And Michael's need for control, for dominance, started small. He'd suggest what I should wear, claiming it was because, "You'll look stunning in this. Trust me." He'd handle all the finances, saying, "You don't need to stress about numbers. Natalia, I've got us covered." I let him, because wasn't that what a good wife did? Trusted her husband? Over time, those suggestions became commands. I couldn't spend from our joint account without his approval. I had to ask before buying groceries that weren't on the list he made. And when I mentioned getting back into design work, his smile turned icy. "Why would you need to work, Natalia? People will think I can't take care of my wife. That's embarrassing for both of us." So I stopped mentioning it. Years slipped by in a haze of wealth and control. I convinced myself it was worth it, that the vacations, the mansion, the endless stream of luxuries compensated for the cracks forming in my freedom. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The breaking point came on a day that should have been ordinary. Michael came home with a leather folder and a stern look. He set it on the marble counter and slid it toward me. "Sign these," he said, his voice flat, without even the pretense of charm. I opened the folder, my stomach tightening. Legal documents, pages and pages of them. "What is this?" I asked. "Just some routine updates. Estate planning, transferring assets into the trust." "Standard stuff," he replied too quickly, avoiding my eyes. My instincts screamed at me, but when I hesitated, his entire demeanor shifted. He leaned closer, his eyes cold. "Natalia, don't make this difficult. You trust me, don't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a warning. I swallowed hard, the pen trembling in my hand. I wanted to say no, to demand an explanation, but the weight of his gaze, the years of control, pinned me down. So I signed. Page after page, my signature scrawled across documents I didn't understand. With every stroke of ink, I felt pieces of my life slipping away, though I didn't yet know how much. That night, lying awake beside him in our cavernous bedroom, I felt the walls closing in. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And I knew if I didn't find out what I had just signed, I might lose more than my freedom. I might lose everything. The next morning, while Michael left for a meeting, I returned to the folder. He'd locked it in his study, but I'd learned long ago where he hid the spare key. My hand shook as I flipped through the documents. My heart dropped as I read the words that blurred before my eyes. Transfer of ownership, relinquishment of rights, sole beneficiary Michael Grant. In that moment, the reality hit me like a freight train. I hadn't just signed routine updates. I had signed away my rights to the estate, to the mansion, to nearly every asset we owned. Everything was now under his name alone. If he chose to leave me, or worse, to discard me, I'd have nothing. No house, no savings, no security. Tears blurred my vision, but fury burned hotter than fear. Michael hadn't just betrayed me. He had cornered me into legal ruin. He thought I was naive, weak, someone who would never dare fight back. But as I stood there clutching the papers, something inside me hardened. I wouldn't let him win. The days that followed were a blur of feigned normalcy. I smiled when he came home, laughed at his shallow jokes, and pretended nothing had changed. But underneath I was plotting. I copied the documents, carefully slipping the originals back into the folder. Then, when Michael was gone one afternoon, I drove to a law office downtown. That's when I met Rebecca. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, a lawyer who radiated confidence. She read through the documents with a frown, her fingers tapping the desk. When she finished, she looked at me gravely. "Natalia, these aren't just unfair, they're coercive. If we can prove you were pressured, these could be overturned." A flicker of hope lit in my chest. "So I'm not powerless?" "Far from it," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Men like your husband think they're untouchable. But they forget that the law doesn't bend only for them. If you're ready to fight, I'll fight with you." That night, I looked at Michael across the dinner table, his face smug as he scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the storm I was preparing. For the first time in years, I felt stronger than my fear. He thought he had trapped me, but he was about to learn that I wasn't the submissive wife he imagined. I was the woman who would burn down his empire if it meant saving myself. The weeks after I discovered the truth about those papers felt like I was living two different lives. On the outside, I was still Natalia, the polished wife, the woman who smiled at neighborhood brunches and accompanied Michael to charity events in my carefully chosen dresses. But inside, I was someone else entirely, a woman quietly gathering strength, learning to sharpen her pain into a weapon. I became a master of performance. Every morning I kissed him goodbye as he left for the office. Every evening I asked about his day. But while he sat across from me at dinner, sipping his wine and discussing investments or his latest deal, my mind wasn't really listening. My mind was cataloging, planning, plotting. Every word he said was another piece of evidence, another breadcrumb leading me deeper into the maze of his deceit. Rebecca had warned me it wouldn't be easy. "Coercion cases take time," she explained, sliding copies of the documents back across her desk to me. "We'll need proof, not just that you signed, but that you signed under pressure. Witnesses, texts, anything that shows you weren't fully consenting." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Proof. That meant digging into the darkest corners of my marriage, pulling up every instance where Michael had controlled, manipulated, or threatened me. It meant reliving moments I had buried, moments where I had swallowed my voice to keep the peace. So I began writing. Late at night, when Michael was asleep, I sat at my desk and documented everything. The time he told me I wasn't allowed to visit my mother because we had appearances to keep. The time he humiliated me in front of friends by mocking my career dreams. The way he always reminded me that everything, the house, the cars, the accounts, was in his name, as though he had been planting the seeds for this very betrayal all along. The more I wrote, the angrier I became. I realized my marriage had been eroding long before those papers. The mansion was just the gilded cage, and I had been its obedient prisoner, but now I was no longer obedient. Rebecca encouraged me to start quietly gathering financial documents, emails, anything I could access. So I played the part of the dutiful wife while secretly combing through drawers, laptops, even Michael's phone when he carelessly left it on the counter. What I found made my stomach turn. There were hidden accounts, transfers to places I didn't recognize, and expenses that didn't add up. One evening, while scrolling through his text messages, I saw a thread with someone labeled only as J. My pulse quickened as I read, "It's almost done. She signed everything. Soon we'll have full control." My breath caught in my throat. We? Who was this J? A partner? An accomplice? Or worse, another woman? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's face, smug and calculating, and the shadow of whoever J was standing behind him. The next morning, I printed the messages and brought them to Rebecca. She scanned them, her jaw tightening. "This is bigger than coercion," she said. "This is fraud. If we can prove he was colluding with someone, possibly to siphon assets, he could face criminal charges." The thought of Michael facing consequences gave me a flicker of satisfaction, but it was quickly overshadowed by dread. If he realized I was onto him, what would he do? Michael wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. "Should I confront him?" I asked. Rebecca shook her head firmly. "Not yet. Let him think you're still in the dark. The more confident he feels, the sloppier he'll get. That's when we strike." So I continued the charade. I wore the dresses he liked, laughed at his tired jokes, let him believe he was still the puppet master. But every time he touched me, every time he called me darling in that smug tone, I felt my resolve harden. One night, though, the mask almost slipped. Michael returned from a meeting later than usual, his tie undone, smelling faintly of perfume I didn't wear. He poured himself a drink, his hands trembling just slightly. I watched him, wondering. If tonight was the night, I would throw the truth in his face. But then he glanced at me, and I remembered Rebecca's warning. So instead, I smiled sweetly and asked, "Long day?" He smirked, taking a sip. "Always, sweetheart, but it's worth it. We're building something big." I forced a laugh, though bile rose in my throat. "I'm sure we are." Inside, I thought, "You're building your downfall, Michael, and I'll be the one to bring it crashing down." Over the next month, Rebecca and I built our case quietly, piece by piece. She introduced me to a forensic accountant, a meticulous man named Daniel, who could unravel financial webs like a magician. He traced Michael's accounts, uncovering layers of hidden funds, shell companies, and suspicious transfers to an entity connected to Jay. When Daniel presented the findings, Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her eyes gleaming. This is it. This is the noose tightening around his neck. But there was one more piece we needed, evidence of the coercion itself. Proof that he had pressured me, that his control was not just implied, but explicit. That came unexpectedly one evening when Michael cornered me in the study. He had been drinking, his words slurred but sharp. "You know," he said, wagging his finger at me, "you should be grateful. Do you have any idea how many women would kill to be in your position? Living here in this house with me, and all I asked was for you to sign some papers. That's nothing. That's loyalty. That's trust." I froze, my heart pounding, but then I remembered my phone in my pocket. Slowly, carefully, I hit record. He kept ranting, his voice rising. "If you ever think of undoing what you signed, don't forget, I control everything. The house, the money, your life. You'd be nothing without me, Natalia. Nothing." The venom in his words, the arrogance dripping from every sentence, sent shivers down my spine. But I stayed calm, nodding like a submissive wife. Inside, though, I was elated. I had what we needed. The next day, I played the recording for Rebecca. She listened, her expression unreadable until the end, when she finally smiled. "That's it. That's the smoking gun." For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. We had him, but as Rebecca started outlining the legal strategy, my mind drifted elsewhere. Revenge wasn't just about the courtroom. Revenge was about making Michael feel what I had felt: cornered, helpless, stripped of power. He had built an empire on control, and I wanted to be the one who pulled the rug out from under him. So I began planning something beyond the law, something personal. I started by being even more agreeable. I praised him, cooked his favorite meals, even suggested we take a trip together. He basked in the attention, completely unaware that every smile, every kiss was another brick in the trap I was building. Behind the scenes, Rebecca and Daniel continued tightening the case, but I began laying the groundwork for something Michael would never see coming: the day I would expose him not just to a judge, but to everyone who had ever thought he was a respectable man. Because I wasn't just going to take back what was mine. I was going to destroy the illusion of who he was. And when that day came, I swore to myself he would finally understand what it felt like to sign away everything that mattered. The day I decided to make the exposure public was the moment everything shifted from chess to fireworks. For months, Rebecca had built a legal fortress around me. Documents authenticated, bank trails mapped, a recorded confession tucked in a folder that felt heavier than any weapon I'd held before. Daniel, the forensic accountant, had traced shell companies, revealed money laundering patterns, and shown how funds disappeared into accounts tied to people I'd never heard of. But legal success, winning in court, wasn't enough for me. I wanted the world to see the man he truly was. I wanted the neighbors who'd once waved as we passed their manicured lawns to know the truth. I wanted his colleagues, the parades of admirers at the firm, the people who posted about our perfect life on social media, to find out that the perfect life was a performance built on coercion and theft. Public exposure felt like justice too, sharp and immediate. So I planned the reveal the way I'd planned everything since the folder: quietly, deliberately, and with an eye toward maximum impact. We waited until Rebecca had filed an injunction to freeze certain assets, so he couldn't move money out of reach, and until the forensic report was finalized. Then we set a date. I told only a few trusted people: Rebecca, Daniel, Dana, the private investigator who'd been invaluable, and one friend who ran a small but influential local news outlet. I wanted a journalist who would care about truth more than ratings. Someone who understood character and the human side of greed. When I told Anna, she felt sick with outrage on my behalf and promised she would run the piece the morning after we served notice of the injunction, once the court filings made the accusations official. Leading up to the day, I kept playing the role of the faithful, slightly naive wife, because Michael's arrogance had taught me he never really looked too hard beneath the surface. He believed his charm was an impenetrable cloak. He'd become sloppy in that comfort, leaving texts unguarded, slipping receipts into the wrong drawer, acting as if no one was watching. The arrogance of a man who thinks himself invincible is the easiest thing in the world to exploit. I poured him wine at dinner, pressed my head into his shoulder in public so the neighbors thought our marriage was unshakable, and let him paint himself as a victim when he complained about work pressures. Inside, I prepared for the storm. The day we filed the injunction, I sat in Rebecca's office with a stack of documents so fat my hands cramped. There were bank statements with arrows and notes in Daniel's neat handwriting, the recording of Michael's threats labeled and transcribed, screenshots of suspicious transfers, and the paper trail showing the trust transfers that I'd signed under duress. Rebecca walked me through the service of process, how the legal notice would be delivered, what the bank would do when it received a formal request to freeze accounts, how the court clerk would assign a judge. She was clinical and fierce, her eyes the color of someone who'd seen too many injustices and had dedicated herself to correcting them. "Once this is on record," she said, "we don't have to depend on rumor anymore. The law is on your side. We served him the morning his firm opened. I watched from a cafe across the street while Dana, inconspicuous in a plain coat, handed the clerk the documents. The look on Michael's face when the receptionist said his name and handed over the envelope was something I'll never forget. Half confusion, half disbelief, the way a man who hasn't truly considered his consequences looks when they finally arrive. He opened it, skimmed the first page, then smiled, assuming it was some mistake. By the time he reached the second page, his smile dropped away and his face turned the color of old paper. He tried to laugh it off in the hallway, but one of his partners saw the tremor in his hands and the way he avoided eye contact. Word spread like a whispered rumor through the office. People began to look at him as if he were a puzzle with a missing piece. 2 days later, Anna's article went live and the world tilted. She didn't sensationalize it. Instead, she told the story with economy and clarity, how coercion can wear the mask of love, how legal documents can be used as weapons, and how the quiet terror of losing everything can compel a person to perform compliance. She included quotes from Rebecca, excerpts from Daniel's analysis, and a careful note about the injunction. She closed with a line that hit me in the chest. In one home, silence was bought and sold, and one woman refused to keep paying. The piece spread faster than I anticipated. Friends called, most with anger on my behalf, some with sorrow, and others with questions about what would happen next. Social media lit up too, with people sharing the article and leaving comments, supportive, outraged, shocked. For the first time since opening the folder in Michael's study, I felt seen. Michael's response was the predictable, pitiful scramble of someone trying to control a narrative that was slipping. He issued a statement through a PR consultant, decrying the false allegations and suggesting that the truth would come out in court. That was a laughable attempt at spin given the weight of the evidence. His colleagues distanced themselves. Invitation lists grew shorter. But PR consultants can only do so much when the facts are neatly filed and subpoena power exists. His phone calls to friends went unreturned. The firm put him on administrative leave pending an internal review. Yet public exposure had consequences beyond the immediate humiliation for me, too. The neighborhood men who once offered to mow his lawn and the women who'd seek fashion advice from me in passing now crossed the street when they saw me. Some people wanted to be a part of my pain, perhaps to validate their own choices. Others wanted to avoid being associated with scandal. There were awkward silences at the grocery store, murmured condolences from the parents at my son's school. We'd always kept our children's lives separate, but in a small community, everything trickled down. It was jarring to be both praised and pitied in the same breath. It was a reminder that revenge can cut both ways. It slashes the betrayer and the betrayed in different places. While the media storm raged, Rebecca and Daniel worked feverishly. They prepared for the inevitable countersuit, the defense strategy that would try to paint me as vindictive and greedy. They prepped witnesses, friends who could attest to the patterns of control, staff who could describe Michael's behavior, and even former employees who'd noticed irregularities in his personal accounts. Daniel's forensic maps were laid out like battle plans. Timelines, annotated flows of money, call logs, overlapping schedules showing when Michael had been in meetings, while someone else signed documents. We even found emails between Michael and a business associate, Jay, where they discussed fiduciary maneuvers that were borderline criminal. The thrill of seeing the map of his deceit come alive was intoxicating and frightening. It was one thing to be violated. It was another to watch the person who violated you laid bare in a stack of undeniable proofs. As all this unfolded, I was also trying to tend to the smaller human things, my safety, the kids, the house. Michael vacillated between belligerence and silence. Some mornings he would stride into the kitchen as if nothing had happened, attempting to put on the charm for the kids. Other times he would throw a plate and storm out. I learned to wear resilience like armor, fielding his tantrums with a neutral tone and keeping the children's routines sacred. They were too young to absorb the legal complexities, but not too young to sense tension. I spoke to them in simple terms, removed the venom of betrayal from the story, and reinforced the message that their home was safe. Their small hands in mine reminded me of the stakes beyond revenge. Everything I did was not just to punish him. It was to ensure a future for them that didn't hinge on a man's caprice. There was a night, about a month after the article, when the strain felt unendurable. Michael had come back late, drunk and loud, shattering a vase in the foyer as the kids slept. He ranted about losing everything, about how I'd ruined him. I stood in the doorway while he paced, watched the raw man he had become, unmasked, raw, scared. It would have been easy to gloat, to rub his failure in his face. Instead, I felt something complicated, a pity for the man who had chosen himself instead of love. But pity did not make me soft. I walked in, gathered the broken pieces into a box, and took it to the garage. The next morning, I donated the vase in a symbolic gesture of turning wreckage into something useful. I was learning how to respond without rage, how to act with intent rather than reaction. The legal hearings were a different kind of public spectacle. The courtroom was crowded, the air thick with the low hum of conversation as neighbors, colleagues, and curious locals leaned forward. Rebecca's cross-examinations were precise. She steered witnesses gently but firmly, extracting admissions without theatrics. Daniel's testimony about the money trails made eyes widen in the gallery. When the private investigator, Dana, took the stand and displayed photos of Michael's meetings in places that matched the emails and receipts, there was a palpable catch in the room's collective breath. The defense attempted to undercut everything with careful insinuations. Wasn't I ambitious? Did I have a motive? Could I have fabricated evidence? Each insinuation was a flicker of smoke meant to distract, but they didn't have the fire to keep the room's gaze diverted. Facts are stubborn things. Outside the courtroom, the firm's PR tried desperately to salvage reputations. They circulated statements about internal reviews and empathy for all parties. But the judge, a stoic man with an expression that suggested he'd seen too many people try to manipulate the truth, called the forensic accountant's evidence compelling. He issued temporary protections, ordered an audit of certain accounts, and scheduled a fuller hearing. It wasn't the final victory, but it was a confirmation that the legal system, at least for now, recognized the seriousness of my claims. Through this period, I felt a surprising tenderness toward myself. I took small steps to rebuild identity beyond the role of the betrayed wife. I returned to the studio I'd abandoned years ago when motherhood and marriage consumed my identity. I painted in quiet hours between hearings, letting color and texture take the edge off the relentless legal grind. My hands, which had always sketched designs, found comfort in physical creation. One painting, a study of windows catching morning light, hung in Rebecca's office, and when she saw it, she said, "That's you. You're the light now." It made me cry because in that moment, I believed it to be true, and there were small victories that were almost private. A neighbor knocked on the door one afternoon with a casserole and an apology. "I had no idea," she said, eyes wet. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." Another friend, whose father worked at the firm, called to say he had quietly spoken to a partner who was appalled by what had been uncovered. These were not headlines. These were the slow, incremental shifts that reminded me I hadn't been alone. People had simply needed time and space to connect the dots. But of course, the story had other players and unpredictable consequences. Michael, stubborn and desperate, began to lash out in ways that felt juvenile and dangerous. He posted thinly veiled insinuations on social media, trying to paint me as erratic, as someone seeking attention. He attempted to enlist mutual friends to back his side, offering them favors and throwing tantrums when they refused. There were moments when I feared he might cross into behaviors that would genuinely endanger us. Rebecca, calm and methodical, filed restraining motions preemptively and made sure our children's school had clear contact protocols just in case. Ashley, my closest friend, slept over for a week to ensure the kids had a steady adult presence. The legal team's preemptive steps kept me safe, but the emotional toll was heavy. Each time Michael flung another accusation, my stomach dropped. I had to remind myself that the facts were on my side and that the process would reveal his choices. The most painful twist in the entire saga was how my parents reacted. They were the last ones I'd expected to waver, people who had always emphasized loyalty and family above everything. But as the story broke, my father, ever the pragmatist, leaned toward caution. He visited Michael in a misguided effort to resolve things quietly, and left with a sense of bewildered loyalty to the man he'd once respected. My mother confided in me that she felt torn. She loved us both and was afraid of the public fallout. Their hesitancy stung, a betrayal more subtle than forged documents but hurtful nonetheless. I had to accept, painfully, that betrayal can take many forms. It is not always a dramatic act. Sometimes it is a silence from the people you expect to stand with you. Yet despite these wounds, despite the fatigue that visited me each night, I felt a deep, unshakable conviction that I had done the right thing. The exposure, the legal fight, the public humiliation, all were instruments in dismantling a pattern of abuse and theft. Men like Michael thrive on secrecy. When secrets are brought into light, their power retreats. That is why I chose to name the betrayal publicly. It wasn't for vengeance alone. It was to ensure that no one else, no young wife, no trusting partner, would have to endure the slow erosion of autonomy that I had suffered. As the hearings continued and the firm reassessed partnerships, I found myself thinking less about retribution and more about the future. The children, my painted windows, the studio, and a quiet life free of coercion began to shape a new horizon. The law can shift assets and responsibility, but it cannot restore time lost. So I set about building meaning with the minutes I had left to claim. I joined a community group for women recovering from financial abuse, and we met in a church basement, exchanged stories, and taught each other how to read contracts, how to spot gaslighting tactics, how to protect ourselves financially. The gratitude in those rooms, people nodding as if they'd finally been given permission to speak, filled me with purpose I hadn't expected. One evening, as the sun set and the courtroom lights dimmed for the day, Rebecca called to say the judge had issued a preliminary ruling that prevented Michael from selling any property until the final hearing. A practical blow, but a crucial one. I stood in the kitchen, the kids at the table doing homework, and the house alive with the hum of ordinary life, and felt a release like a lungful of clean air. The legal system was slow and imperfect, but in that moment it had done one thing well. It had protected my family from sudden dispossession while the truth unfolded. There is a strange humility in watching someone's life unravel when you never wanted power over them to begin with. I never cheered the man's misfortune. Rather, I watched with a near-clinical curiosity as the consequences of choices came to roost. People often talk about revenge as a satisfying finale, but the reality is that it's messy. There's no neatness to it, no cinematic closure that fits inside a neat paragraph. What I had sought was restoration, a chance to fix what had been broken and to prevent further harm. If that required tearing down a facade and putting everything under a microscope, then so be it. The final hearing arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day where the air smells faintly of leaves and the world feels both brittle and alive. I remember standing in front of the mirror before leaving the house, staring at my reflection. The woman looking back at me was not the same woman who had once obediently signed documents without question. She was steadier, sharper, her jaw set with quiet determination. I adjusted the white blouse I had chosen deliberately, simple, strong, unpretentious, and thought, this is the armor I carry today. Walking into the courthouse, I felt the weight of eyes on me. There were reporters clustered near the steps, microphones pointed, flashes popping as though this was a red carpet event instead of the culmination of years of betrayal. I ignored the questions. Do you think you'll win? What would you say to your husband right now? And kept walking. Rebecca was beside me, her presence calm and unwavering. She leaned closer as we entered the building and whispered, breathe. This is your day. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Michael was already there, sitting at the defendant's table in a dark suit that looked more expensive than his current financial reality should allow. His hair was perfectly styled, but there was a tension in his posture, a twitch in his jaw. He glanced at me as I entered, and for a split second I saw the man I once loved, the man who had promised me forever. But the illusion shattered the moment I remembered the words he had hissed at me in our study. You'd be nothing without me. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began. Rebecca opened with a concise, powerful statement. This case is about coercion, control, and betrayal. It is about a man who used love as a mask to strip his wife of her rights, and a woman who found the courage to reclaim her voice. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Then came the evidence. Document after document was presented. The contracts I had been forced to sign, the financial records showing Michael's transfers, the emails between him and his accomplice, Jay, discussing how to consolidate assets once I was out of the picture. Daniel took the stand, walking the court through the forensic trails with surgical precision. His charts and timelines painted a picture too detailed to dismiss. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand with my heart pounding so hard I thought the microphone might pick it up. Rebecca guided me gently, her questions designed to draw out the story without sensationalism. I spoke about the night Michael placed the folder in front of me, the pressure in his eyes, the way my hand shook as I signed. I spoke about years of small controls that added up to this moment, the way he isolated me, belittled me, convinced me that my dreams and opinions were secondary to his ambitions. And then Rebecca played the recording. The courtroom filled with Michael's own voice. If you ever think of undoing what you signed, don't forget. I control everything. The house, the money, your life. You'd be nothing without me. The words echoed like a dagger in the silence that followed. I watched the faces in the courtroom shift, jurors stiffening, reporters scribbling furiously, even the judge's expression tightening. Michael's lawyer tried to discredit me, painting me as vindictive, as someone who had orchestrated this to gain financially. But each attempt unraveled under Rebecca's steady counterpoints. When the lawyer suggested I had exaggerated Michael's control, Rebecca simply gestured toward the recording. The defendant's own words, she said firmly. There is no exaggeration here. The defense tried one last tactic, bringing Michael to the stand. He walked up with forced confidence, adjusting his tie, and began spinning the story of a misunderstood husband. He spoke about providing for me, about the pressures of his career, about how I had misinterpreted his intentions. But under cross-examination, his facade cracked. When Rebecca asked, if your intentions were honorable, why did you hide transfers under shell companies? He stammered. When she asked, why did you write in an email, she won't suspect a thing until it's too late? His face reddened, his words faltered. By the end, the courtroom saw him not as the successful, charming husband he once presented himself to be, but as a manipulator who had underestimated the woman he vowed to love. The judge's ruling came after what felt like hours but was only 30 minutes. He began by acknowledging the gravity of the case. Marriage is built on trust, he said, and when trust is weaponized for financial gain, The law cannot stand idle. He declared the documents void due to coercion, ordered the assets restored to joint ownership, and froze Michael's personal accounts pending further investigation into fraud. He granted me sole ownership of the mansion and awarded spousal support, citing Michael's egregious behavior. As the gavel struck, a rush of emotion surged through me. Relief, vindication, triumph. Michael sat frozen, his face pale, his empire crumbling in real time. I didn't look at him as I stood. I didn't need to. The sound of the gavel had said everything. Outside, the reporters swarmed again. This time I paused. I didn't give a statement, but I looked directly into one camera, my expression calm, unshaken, and let them take their photos. It wasn't vanity, it was reclamation. For so long I had been silenced, erased. Now I was visible again. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Michael's firm announced his termination. Business associates cut ties. Jay, his mysterious partner, was identified and indicted on charges of fraud. Social circles that once adored us now whispered about his downfall, and while some still pitied me, most expressed awe at my resilience. But my victory wasn't just public, it was personal. The first night I slept in the mansion alone, officially mine, I walked through every room with a sense of liberation. No more walking on eggshells. No more wondering which version of Michael would come through the door. The house that had once felt like a cage was now a sanctuary. I began rebuilding my life with deliberate choices. I redecorated the study, the very room where I had signed away my rights, transforming it into an art studio. I painted the walls white, filled the shelves with brushes and paints, and let the sunlight pour through the windows. Every canvas I painted felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. My friendships deepened, too. Women who had once envied me now sought my advice, not because of the life I had, but because of the strength I found when it collapsed. I started speaking at local groups, sharing my story with women who were struggling in controlling relationships. I told them, the moment you think you're powerless is the moment they've almost won. Almost. But you are never powerless. Not if you find your voice. Months passed, and life took on a rhythm again. Not the rhythm of wealth and appearances, but of authenticity and choice. I laughed more easily, breathed more deeply, and trusted myself in ways I never had before. The scars were still there, yes, but they no longer defined me. They reminded me of the battle I had fought and won. One evening, as the sun set over the mansion's garden, I sat outside with a glass of wine and thought about revenge. People often ask if it satisfied me, if seeing Michael lose everything made it worth it. And the truth is, revenge wasn't the end goal. It was survival. It was making sure he couldn't erase me, couldn't strip me of my identity or my security. The satisfaction came not from his downfall, but from my rise. From the woman I became in the ashes of betrayal, Michael tried to destroy me with a pen. But in the end, it was that very pen, the evidence of his coercion, that destroyed him. I am Natalia. I am 30 years old. I was betrayed, cornered, almost erased. But I fought back and I won. Not just in court, not just in the eyes of the world, but in my own heart. And that victory is mine forever.